Ladies and gentlemen, these past few months have tried and tested us all, as we have had to quickly adapt to radical worldwide changes, among them using web-based meeting platforms. I am therefore welcoming you via video message, and I am very pleased to address you on this occasion, as the subject of this webinar is extremely relevant and important to us here in Iceland. The utilization of geothermal energy is part of our modern history and economic development. A century ago, Icelandic visionaries pioneered the heating of Reykjavik household by using geothermal district heating. At the time, it was a brave and costly decision for a poor, newly sovereign nation. But the turn away from coal and oil to renewable energy proved to be one of Iceland's most important policy decisions in the last century. This green decision was born out of practical necessity and paved the way for a modern and prosperous society. It was not only right, but the only option that could truly bring our country to the next level of development. The social and economic benefits were enormous, and today we can add climate benefits to that list as well. In addition to space heating and electricity production, we have learned to use geothermal energy in a variety of other sectors, such as in agriculture and food production. We produce vegetable in greenhouses and cultivate aquatic species in land-based aquaculture. We dry some of our hay and barley, and last but not least, we dry fish products, such as cotheads for export markets. In a relatively short history of industrial development, the people of Iceland have gained extensive knowledge and experience in the use of geothermal energy for food production. We have proven that it can be applied with good results in the cold climate of the Arctic. One could even say that Iceland is a leader in the direct use of geothermal energy in the region. For this reason, we stand ready to share our knowledge and experience, not only with other Arctic countries, but with partners across the globe as well. As part of our development cooperation programs, we have for a long time supported our partner countries in the developing world in utilizing geothermal energy for food production. Here I can mention drying of grain in Kenya, an initiative that came out of a geothermal exploration project in that region. We have also helped to establish the African Geothermal Center of Excellence and supported the African Women Energy Entrepreneurs Framework. Dear guests, as I conclude, I would like to thank you for joining us online today to discuss the important role of geothermal energy, food security, and regional development. I would also like to thank the organizers for convening this webinar. Of course, it would have been more enjoyable to be with you in person. And we must remain hopeful that we can all meet again soon. I hope you have a fruitful and productive discussion today.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see everyone here today and to have such a wonderful turnout. I'm Jennifer Spence. I'm the Executive Secretary of the Sustainable Development Working Group of the Arctic Council, and I'm pleased to help moderate today's session. We'll start with a few little housekeeping items before we get into the substantive discussion. So I just want to remind you about the code of conduct that you were introduced to when you registered. So we ask that you keep yourselves muted when you're not speaking and your cameras off unless you are speaking. This will help to keep everything nice and clean. And we invite you to ask any questions you might have in the chat, or if you would like to ask a question, you can indicate that in the chat as well. So we welcome you to this session and we're looking forward to a great discussion. I'm particularly excited about this session. I think it's fantastic to see a session that brings together the ideas of regional development and food security and energy. Very often we talk about these things in isolation, and I think it's incredibly important that we start to see the interconnections between them. And so given the work that we do at the Sustainable Development Working Group, these are topics that are near and dear to our hearts, and we really welcome, and I'm looking forward to learning from all the experts that we have here today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Bjarni Herrera, the CEO of Circular Solutions, who's going to be speaking about shaping of regional sustainability indicators in the creation, implementation, and monitoring of sustainable development in the Iceland. Bjarni.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna put my slides up. I hope you can see them well. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you here today. Very exciting platform. I am going to, I guess, set the stage a little bit about the sustainability aspect of our discussion today. Or at least help shed some light on kind of how the sustainability space and approach and methodologies have been changing over the last few years, perhaps. I come from this company, Circular Solutions, and we have been providing sustainability consulting in Iceland and in the Nordics for 4 years now. Working with both municipalities, listed and non-listed companies, just to provide you with a range of kind of our approach, just as a kind of an introduction of where I'm coming from. But most importantly, of course, the reason why I'm here today is to provide some insight into how this sustainability thinking is changing. So on this slide in front of you, you can see that, of course, sustainability is our objective. We are developing our companies, our regions, our society, our world, I mean, towards sustainability. We want to be sustainable. So how do we get there? There are essentially two frameworks which have been in use for some time now in order for us to progress towards sustainability. Corporate social responsibility, and now increasingly ESG, meaning environmental, social, and governance. And it seems to be a common understanding between market players, financial markets, region, international organizations, that ESG is better equipped to be the framework we should use to work ourselves towards sustainability rather than CSR. ESG evolves around metrics, impacts, first and foremost. So working with data, being able to show development and progress, that is really the key of ESG. But before we kind of choose relevant indicators, metrics, to provide us with the relevant impacts, we are really looking towards establishing first what type of profile we are working with. Let's imagine we're looking at 3 different regions. They may be located in different areas, different climates, have different exposure to businesses and industry. So the weight of their environmental, social, and governance exposure and risks may or may not be different. So based on those profiles, we can only start to find the relevant indicators for that specific region. Of course, also there can be the same indicators chosen between a country or a region, let's say the Nordic regions, for comparison, but there are definitely individualities there. Also, in terms of the United Sustainable Development Goals, due to the different risk profile, different location, different exposure to industry and business, etc., the potential positive and negative contribution a region can have on the progress of the United Sustainable Development Goals can definitely be different, as well as is illustrated here. So these couple of slides only to point out that for relevant metrics, relevant indicators, we have to consider different profiles of different regions. So that's that for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a number of questions, but I'll just ask one for now, and I'm sure others will have questions for you later. I'm wondering what do you mean by governance? What does governance mean in this context? Yeah,
good question. I mean, governance can be management structure of I mean, I guess regions in this example, I guess for companies as well. It can be the scope of risk management. It can be compliance programs. It can be bribery and corruption programs. It can be whistleblower programs, stakeholder communication, engagement assessments, ESG reporting governance, and signatories, for example, to international organizations, for example.
Great, excellent, thank you. Well, again, I have other questions, but I'll let the other presenters go on, and hopefully we can get to them later. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So next, I'm pleased to introduce to you Alicia Stoksloza. I'm sorry I'm mispronouncing your last name, who's the project manager of GEORG, Geothermal Research Cluster. And she's going to be speaking about the role and use of geothermal energy in the Arctic, analysis of the Icelandic case, synthesis of best practices and lessons learned.
Yes, thank you for this beautiful introduction. I believe Iceland is quite a unique case if we gonna talk about that. And if it comes to the geothermal, of course, energy use. However, this still can be inspirational for other Arctic country neighbors. Mr. Minister has mentioned a lot of really good things about the prime energy use, and as well the transition which we in Iceland has went through early 40s with the oil and coal, and as well decrease into the use of the potential of geothermal energy. In meantime, we have created as well teams created the resource park in late 70s to foster so-called society without the waste and the use of natural resources. However, this everything of that we are using as well, this know-how, we are now trying as well to share as the worldwide within different types of projects. For like technical assistance in the projects, geothermal education. One of the oldest geothermal training programs in Iceland is actually running in Iceland now, currently under the UNESCO wings. Then we have geothermal utilization, like was mentioned as well before. In here in Reykjavik and other parts, it's space heating. Then we have greenhouse agriculture for food production, for biotech, to provide all year round the food sources that's both steady and as well nutritious, and as well as was mentioning as well before, the food drying procedures to provide long-term storage without any degradations. I'm coming from the geothermal research cluster, and we are young, we're 10 years old, and we see that there is a big gap, and as well we try to build on the long tradition of cooperation between different sectors in Iceland, the bridge which shows the research and help the research fill up the gap and go into the industry to build the potential and build more cooperation, where we think it's one of the most important parts. The important role of the geothermal in the Arctic, there is a lot of the points. However, here from my heart, I would say that the energy transition from the coal to geothermal, the biggest input would be this localizing the direct use, realizing that the potential differences between the Arctic regions are very important, and the use of their local advantages is the point and the key thing. Stimulate the businesses and opportunities in different parts, and let the governments to allow people to showcase and as well teach them how to do this and engage them into communication. Engage the community in define the geothermal policies, define how to do the things, in how to make the steps forward and how to build them. All of those little things are important within the knowledge transfer. They cannot be done without that. So that's why as well a peak of it is the knowledge transfer in between the Arctic regions, which should be the key point in all our conversations. From my heart, I can say that case studies are the models to accelerate geothermal energy in the Arctic. I have been involved in different case studies. However, one of the most important, the ones which I can use now, are projects which we are cooperating, which are fostering around here. This is Geothermica, Crowdthermal, and totally new initiative, which my previous speaker as well, together with AMER and Circular, we've been creating with DERASO initiative. However, all of them, Geothermica is more ministerial, Crowdthermal is more public engagement, and here the DERASO is more regional. But I can see that they have similar points like policy strategy frameworks, tightly interconnected networks of ministries, public engagements, regional municipalities. All that are the points which we can use. Then we have community engagements, how the social tools can be used, how tweeting, Facebooking, hashtagging can be somehow engaging for the younger generations to teach them and showcase how the geothermal has the potential as well in their local gardens. Alternative financing scheme. We know that without the money it's difficult to do something. However, in Crowdthermal, we are pushing out the very common currently, the crowdfunding. In Geothermica, we are utilizing a lot of areas to build joint calls and transnational cooperation and to co-fund the projects in this way. And as well, in the last part, in DERASO initiative, we provide the tools, or we want to provide the tools and develop regional opportunities to build this innovation. As the closing part of that, I can say the countries around the Arctic need the strong leadership to accomplish this energy transition ahead and commit sharing the knowledge and experience contributing to the best use of the geothermal energy. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alicia. It's fascinating. I'm wondering, I mean, I'm a big fan of case studies as well. I wonder if do you have any case studies that deal specifically with food and food security in any way?
We do as well. However, one of the closest one which I can tell you now, we have one of the projects within the Geothermica. There's a lot of 8 new projects, and we have as well one of them which is called GeoFood, and it's supported by Geothermica ministries in there. And I totally encourage you to check that on the website. And it's the newest of the initiatives, and how the innovation can be used together with the geothermal. How this is one of the joint calls we are running in there, and probably the new one will come with the new new initiatives we are building up soon.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll now invite our next speaker. Oops. So our next speaker is, sorry, I'm losing my notes, Martin van der Hout, and he is the former Secretary General of the Dutch Association of Geothermal Operators, I can say that, food security and production in cold climates, analysis of the Dutch case, synthesis of best practices and lessons learned. Please.
Thank you, Jennifer. I will open my screen as well. There it is. Like I was introduced, my name is Martin van der Hout, and I have a background both in the greenhouse industry as well as in geothermal. Geothermal in the Netherlands is now active for over 10 years. And all, I'm having difficulties with moving my screen. Sorry, what's happening? Ah, there it is. All 20 doublets in the Netherlands are producing geothermal for the greenhouse industry, and it's now about 10% of the total energy demand for the greenhouses. And the Netherlands is a big country. If you count on greenhouses, we have over 21,800 acres of greenhouses in our country. And the normal energy which is used is natural gas. So we have a lot of challenges for getting the greenhouses sustainable. If you want me to do a small wrap-up in 5 minutes about lessons learned, I've divided them over the planet, people, and profit. And not like Bjarni says about government as well, but of course it's part of my analysis. If you let me summarize it, the interconnection between responsibilities, risk, roles, and returns are needed, and they all should be in harmony to have a sustainable system. So if I move on to the environmental summarization, I think the best practices we had is that all pioneer operators from the last 10 years cooperated and shared their knowledge and experiences. And by doing this, they developed industry standards which are fit for legislation and for environmental policies and so on. And it made them aware that it took almost 3 years from start until setting up a geothermal project. Lessons learned is that actually we started green geothermal without a vision from the public-private governance or mutual intention. Entrepreneurs just started with geothermal because they were in need of sustainable heat. And actually after a couple of years, geothermal cooperation between the private and the public sector came up, and one of the results is that we developed the master plan geothermal energy in the Netherlands, and it's all available on the internet. So I recommend you also to open it up. It's very interesting. If you let me summarize the social aspects for the best practices, is that actually it was a very good initiative that the greenhouse entrepreneurs themselves started up geothermal. So the entrepreneurs were both growers as well as customers for sustainable heat, as well operators. So they all took it in one. So they were really on top of everything which made it happen. So it's very important to know it from the source until the greenhouse, how to optimize the system. I think the challenge ahead of us is that these single entrepreneurs, if they want to move forward, they need to cooperate more. So in future, the single initiatives won't be future-proof. So you see more and more bigger companies coming up in the Netherlands, but also abroad, of course, getting geothermal as a business. The other thing which needs to be, how can I say, developed in our country is that we do not have a solid social acceptance for geothermal. It's such a crowded place over here, and we more or less have a complete trauma about Groningen in the gas field. So we have a lot of worries in the society about mining. The next point, the economical, so the profit way, is that one of the successes, actually the important success, is that we have a good combination of both a feed-in tariff and a public insurance scheme. So that makes it better for external finance to invest in geothermal. So you have more risk covered because of these insurances and these feed-in tariffs. we have a lot of couple of challenges, of course. The energy and the CO2 market are very volatile, and we have to deal with unforeseen operational issues. So a lot of it is under construction. Summarization of me is that we have to deal with a lot of challenges, and I think what's both happening in the Netherlands for these challenges probably can also be helpful for the other countries. This was more or less my wrap up in 5 minutes, I hope, Jennifer.
Wonderful, pretty close. You did very well. I think it's very interesting to me when I think about the northern context. There's I think three things I really took away from what you said is, I mean, there's a time investment. This does not happen quickly. There's a technical capacity, and then there's sort of human capacity. I'm thinking about in the northern context, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but what would that sort of mean in a northern or an Arctic context, do you think? There's not the same issues of space limitations per se, but probably in terms of the cost and the capacity issues. How do you overcome some of those things?
Well, I was wondering, I think the human factor, the human capital on having everything connected into each other and have the system work and really make business out of it. And also, how can I say, be both the owner of the food production as well as the energy production to fit this all together. I think this is really a big opportunity for countries who do not produce their vegetables or whatsoever in greenhouses yet. So I think the knowledge factor is the most important one.
Wonderful, thank you. That's great, and I hope we can get more questions to you in a little bit. So thank you.
You're welcome.
I'd now like to invite Heider Gordonsson, who's the chairman of the Arctic Economic Council, and he's going to speak about involvement of private and industrial stakeholders in regional and municipal development in the Arctic. Heider.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar. So what I wanted to do in just 5 minutes is to go through some, let's say, foundations of building sustainable businesses in the Arctic. And I'll try to focus a little bit on the more sort of remote communities. I'm not going to discuss a lot the developed communities. There are very different challenges, whether you are in a remote community or in a community that's highly developed. So what we have developed at the Arctic Economic Council is the Arctic Investment Protocol. It's basically a corporate social responsibility tool where we have 6 simple principles that we believe if companies sort of adhere to, they will make sure that their undertakings will be socially responsible and sustainable. It's not very well known that the Arctic has a fantastic track record of economic development. Basically, there's no other area in the world which has had more sustainable economic development over centuries. And it doesn't matter whether you look towards oil and gas or mining or fishing, agriculture, hunting. We have an exemplary track record in all these areas. And I believe the reason why is that the people that have been undertaking these investments and building their economies, they have been mostly local people. Not a lot of outside capital has been coming in. So it's been done under the watchful eye of the people that live in the area. So what we're trying to help out with newcomers to the area is to give them the Arctic Investment Protocol so that they can do it, let's say, in the Arctic way. But on the subject, on the geothermal subject, I'm from Iceland. Of course, there are challenges in Iceland with having food security. We cannot simply produce all the food that we want to have here. We import most of it. The same holds true for Greenland, and in the more remote communities, there are different challenges because They don't even have transport, proper transport, year-round sort of, let's say, weekly transport. So transport is key. Transport is key to all business. If we cannot exchange, if we cannot transport goods and services, we cannot do any business, basically. So if we look down into the sort of foundations of transport, basically, it always starts with a port. You cannot build a road without having a port, because you cannot get any construction equipment on shore unless you have a port. And you cannot build an airport unless you have roads. So it all goes hand in hand. It's all connected. But what is happening now is that more and more capital is going to infrastructure. So if we divide, as the OECD does, infrastructure into two, it's basically social infrastructure, which is schools, hospitals, etc., more like services. And then it's economic infrastructure, which is ports, roads, airports, and also energy grids and energy production. So what I'm trying to say is basically that we need to, in those remote areas, to kick off development, we need to make sure that the right infrastructure is in place. I believe we have the right sort of regulatory, the right regulations in place, the right regulatory environment. And I believe there's a lot of interested international capital that's willing to commit to building infrastructure under the watchful eye of the regulators, but also their own voluntary sort of subscription of CSR, like the Arctic Investment Protocol. So then I'm basically down to scalability. What will be the scalability of geothermal agriculture in the Arctic? And also what will be the scalability of the ports, the roads, the electricity grids, the geothermal that's also needed. So then it becomes interesting. And in that field, I'm not an expert, so I'm going to rely on you for that. But I'm very happy to participate, and I hope to, and I'm sure I will learn a lot from this conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I mean, Iceland is so, it's such an amazing model when it comes to the use of geothermal. And as the chair of the Arctic Economic Council, I wonder how much interest you found as sort of from other Arctic countries about this idea of geothermal and learning from Iceland in particular.
Yeah, of course you have like, let's say low-grade geothermal or high-grade geothermal. And just here, let's say 500 kilometers west of where I'm sitting, I have Greenland. And the south tip of Greenland has a lot of geothermal. Even the northeast of Greenland has a lot of geothermal. But there are no people really living in the northeast. There's only 500 or so. But they make a limited use of it. What they lack is scalability. What they lack is sort of, let's say, a permanent plan of how to make use of it. But in Qaqortoq and around there in the southwest, which is actually south of Oslo, it's that far south, you have immense opportunities. But also to build, like we've done here with the Blue Lagoon, with geoparks, etc. They can definitely make good use of some of the experience we have accumulated here in Iceland for development, because everything is interconnected, like I was trying to say. So if you have a geothermal power plant or geothermal for district heating, there's a lot of other stuff that comes with it. So it's not just for, let's say, greenhouses. There's all kinds of aquaculture that also opens up to its doors, tourism, and a lot more.
Yeah, I've seen some wonderful examples of that. I've had the privilege of seeing some of those, so I completely agree. I think there's a lot to learn there. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd now like to invite David Try, who's the board chair and board director of Kitsalis Geothermal Inc. And he is going to speak about the perspectives from First Nations Kitsalis on the development of geothermal energy in British Columbia, Canada. David.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm just trying to turn on my video, but it won't allow me to start it. So I hope my microphone's working.
We can hear you loud and clear.
First of all, thank you for the invitation. I start by saying that Kitsilus First Nations is really at the starting line of all the geothermal projects that you described. And I'll just talk briefly about Kitsilus, and then I'll talk about food security, and then I'll talk about geothermal and the link in 5 minutes. So Kitsilus people are Aboriginal or First Nations or Canadian Indians, and they've been living in Northwest BC about 140 kilometers in or east of the Pacific Ocean, about halfway up the province of British Columbia in Canada. My wife and I and all our kids have lived here, about half the Kitsilus people live on one of two Kitsilus communities or lands reserved for Indians about 100 years ago by the Canadian federal government. And we live in a large river valley within the coastal mountain range. In terms of food security, in the north, there's a growing interest in self-sufficiency and local food growth in a very broad cultural, start my video, in a very broad cultural way. I should say that there's only one road from where we live, basically from the Pacific Ocean to the nearest big town is Prince George, and that is 800 kilometers, and it goes through the mountains. But it's good highway. And we suffer or benefit, one of the two, from snow, rock, and mud slides or avalanches, which are annual events, and close that highway, usually for a day, sometimes two, once for a week. And by the end of a week, you suddenly realize how dependent you are on a food supply chain. We do get occasional snow dumps, I call them, too. The largest I've seen was 2 meters in one day, which kind of shuts everything else down. And by the way, the railway lines follow the road, as do the hydro and the internet lines. So when the roads are out, the options are to bring something up by barge, maybe 700 or 800 kilometers up the coast and then up the river, or you can fly it in. The first thing you tend to run out of in a shortage is 1, gasoline, and 2, food, fresh food. Kitsilus First Nations has got a long, long history of harvesting, and by that I mean like berry picking, use for medicine, fishing, and hunting, as there was no supermarkets here 5,000 years ago. Family fishing is an event up here, and so myself and 4 other families, all of Sue's relatives, would go fishing once a year, and they would consider that to be a very highly cultural event of smoking the fish. If you were here, I would be bringing some fish down and we would enjoy some smoked salmon together. As well, berry picking and hunting are events that most people participate in. So it's not new to us to have self-sustainability in food. In Kitsilus itself, one community initiative gave each house a personal garden box. They're about 2 meters by 1 meter, and they also included the soil and the seeds. I grow carrots, not well, but I do grow carrots. We also have something called community gardens, which were created in both of our communities, and people, such as my wife, go over and work in those gardens. If you were here, we could look out the window right over there and see the community garden beside my house. And that food, when we harvest it, is typically shared with the elders first, and then with other community members. In the bigger subdivision, a large greenhouse was built just last year, which appears to be doing very well. But we do have one paid employee out there, which creates costs, of course. The food, I mentioned the food that's harvested. We have a good food box for healthy living, which runs on Thursday. So on Thursday, we go over to the community health center and they give out basically boxes of healthy free food, including the gardening output when we're in gardening season. Let me just switch to the geothermal just for a minute before concluding. There are natural hot springs nearby that Kitsilus people have been using for the thousands of years for pleasure, medical reasons, and just enjoyment. They also exist further north and south of our territory too. Just north of us was Canada's last volcanic eruption in about 1780, which generated 22 kilometers of lava flow. So we're basically on the ring of fire, which makes the Kitsilus economic development, which is basically the business or economic development arm of the Kitsilus First Nation, I chair that board, has been exploring commercial geothermal project for 8 years now. Our research, including drilling pilot holes this year, has shown there is a substantive geothermal reservoir centered just a few kilometers south of the local airport and industrial park. probably 7 kilometers from where I'm sitting right now. And it's large enough to be commercially viable. The current plan will see commercial operations start up at the end of 2022, 1.5 years from now. 2 years. This is Canada's first direct use project. So there's just a few regulatory headaches. I am a retired government policy and manager, and I am pretty good at navigating regulatory authorities, but my goodness, this has given me more than one headache. We're making steady progress. The only other direct use geothermal project in Canada, think how big that place is they found it by accident while they were looking for oil and gas, and they use it for some direct use processes. To be commercially viable, the project must serve hundreds of clients. Nobody could use all of this heat. And so our plan is to include commercial greenhouses in the industrial parks. It will support healthy eating in the community, and we all are interested in food. So commercial demand is no problem. We can sell anything we can grow. So I'm very interested in listening to people who are much further along the path than I am, and I appreciate your time this morning. Thank you.
Wonderful, David. Thank you so much. Well, as a Canadian, I find this very interesting as well. I wonder how much you feel that this is just the tip of the iceberg for what's possible in Canada. And I mean, it strikes me that, I mean, what you're describing in terms of the limitations of a small remote community are things that are faced by a lot of northern communities. So do you feel, or do you find that this could be something that could be applied in other contexts in places like Canada that are remote?
It's the west side of Canada, or the province of British Columbia, where all the Ring of Fire comes across. And this area of the country, not just Kitsilus, is certainly well positioned to take advantage of geothermal energy. In other places, you have to drill deeper, and that makes getting the water or the heat up to the ground more expensive. I expect we'll go down 1.5 to 2 kilometers to get the optimum temperature that we're seeking. So we've got a natural advantage in the west, but it's a regulatory thicket is a good word to use here.
Which is a very, I mean, as you said, it's breaking new ground, which is part of why the regulatory system isn't well designed for it. But it's a really excellent point to that part of it needs to be adjusted to in order to make this possible. So thank you. I'm now actually going to open it up for discussion. So if all our panelists would like to turn their cameras on, maybe we can have the group come together and we'll see what kind of questions we get. I'd invite the audience to ask any questions they might have. We have our panelists. Well, maybe while I'm waiting, if I'll leave it open for anybody who wants to ask. I'm curious because what I heard David speaking about is what I would call food sovereignty. This idea that it's not just about getting access to healthy food, but that you need to be able to do it within a localized place. Because it's very hard to sometimes get those transportation routes aren't always accessible, which is quite common in the Arctic. So I'm curious from people's perspective, how much is geothermal an option to address these issues of food sovereignty from your perspective? And just jump right in. Yes, please, Martin. Yes, please.
Well, I believe both in local energy ownership as well as local food ownership, which more or less is the same as sovereignty. From a Dutch context, we supply food all over Europe. So yeah, what is local? Can you have the discussion in the end? And there it's more or less about scale, I think. But of course, in general, to be, how can I say, independent from you as a person, but also as a region or maybe a country or like Europe. Those are already probably some political, economical questions, but I can for sure imagine that it makes me proud. I have a garden myself, growing my own food. But I can imagine that that countries and cities who are quite isolated around the globe on the Arctic can have the same. Yeah, for sure. Being independent, I think it's a geopolitical matter as in the end as well.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that the next question that comes to mind is what Heather raised, which is this issue of scalability. And is there a limit to how small, like in terms of the cost of investment, in terms of return on investment, is there a limit to what you can do? Or is geothermal quite flexible that way? And this is me asking, I don't have the answer. I'm not an expert in this. So I'm hoping someone here might be able to speak to the flexibility of geothermal from that perspective.
Well, if I maybe comment on this, I think geothermal is in some places where you have very low thermal gradient. Of course, it has to be enough to cover the cost of drilling, which is the biggest uncertainty and biggest risk in the project. But if you have high thermal gradient, for example, like in Iceland, I think the access to low temperature geothermal is in most cases so high that I would say we have unlimited almost potentials of growing food, and the food capacity, the capacity for us to grow food is on a much bigger scale than the needs for just covering Iceland. But I think this a lot depends on the cost of drilling and other uses, and there are very exciting opportunities where you have it with for example, binary plants or low enthalpy so-called plants which produce electricity maybe above 70 degrees Celsius, and co-locate greenhouses with such an operation where you can both create electricity and provide heat for greenhouses. But I think the biggest hindrance will always be the cost of drilling if you need to drill deep, and that means you have to develop probably a big project or many users at the same location to adapt to the cost of drilling.
Great, thank you. Oh yes, please, Martin.
Yeah, very very shortly following that comment as well. I think it's quite inevitable not to think larger, as you say, Sigurður, that focusing only on the greenhouses, I think would be a limitation factor for us. When we do the geothermal, try to incorporate as much as possible, have the big picture with energy supply together with the food. That's don't limit yourself.
Now, can I ask, and I know just, oh, please, David.
I was just going to say that one of the challenges with the geothermal for us is that it's seasonal, where you use it to heat buildings, just literally winter heat for commercial buildings like the airport. We use it to heat greenhouses, and those things we only use them seasonally. We can technologically do something to use that energy to cool with, kind of like a refrigerator, but that adds quite a bit to the cost. And we've got a couple of what I call anchor tenants, or people that need to use the geothermal all year long. So if we conclude the deals with those people, they will effectively end up with free hot water. And one of the things I like about geothermal greenhouses is it is scalable. I can start with 2, and then I've got lots of land. I've got 100 acres of land sitting right there. So I can put one in, then another one, then another one. I don't have to leap in with 25. That's all. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Merit, did you want to, I see you have arrived. Did you want to speak on this as well?
Yeah. Well, I was here, but I was.
Oh yes, I know.
Yes.
Just visually.
Exactly. Yes. No, I think this is a fascinating discussion, and I really like, because I'm with you, Jennifer, this interconnection between food security, regional development, and energy access, and making affordable access. I think that nexus of the 3, let's say, strands is so great that we have that conversation, and which is why it's fantastic to see geothermal making it in the way of sustainable food production. I have a question for Bjarni, because we're working very hard within the IGA, and I have to say this is really Iceland who's leaning on this in terms of our geothermal sustainability assessment protocol, so the GSAP, which we have let's say, adopted from our friends at hydropower, for whom sustainability and corporate governance is a key thing. And we believe at the IDA that sustainability is the key as well for really reaching the Sustainable Development Goals, but also really contributing to a net zero future. So Bjarni, I saw in your presentation, you said something, and I noted it down. You said something like the death of CSR. And here we come with all the ESG factors. So could you, from your perspective, from AIMER's perspective, but also from your own work that you do with all the companies in Iceland and abroad, how do you look at geothermal, and how can we really factor all these ESG important factors into, well, corporate governance, but social and the environmental strands that we all need to work on?
Good question, thank you. The death of CSR title was definitely meant to be kind of provocative to you know, get a certain dialogue going on here in Iceland, which became, I mean, we were successful in creating the dialogue. So, but definitely ESG factors are crucial in the development of, I guess, any industry, across industries. Definitely for geothermal as well. I mean, we've been working with the national power company here in Iceland, as well as Reykjavik Energy, and increasingly other geothermal and energy players with operations in different countries and continents. So, I mean, obviously we are looking at both project level indicators in terms of, you know, energy generated, employment generated around projects, different governance factors around different projects, including communication with the local communities and defining specific indicators in that realm. So both project and, of course, operational indicators, which I mentioned previously, both on the E, S, and G. So, I mean, for geothermal, and as I said, across industries and sectors, this is definitely something crucial to bear in mind for any business opportunities as well, for any player in the geothermal space to secure contracts and projects and such. I hope that answers your question, Marit.
Yeah, very much. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Very good. Thank you.
I have a question. I was curious, Martin mentioned the sort of the tensions in the Netherlands around the connections being made between geothermal and mining. And I'm curious to hear more about the sort of the social responsibility, the reaction and how it's managed, but whether or not you see that in all places or if that's unique to the Netherlands, that where that connection is made between mining and geothermal. Yes, please, Peter.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, it's peculiar that the biggest challenge for the Arctic is to enlighten people which are non-Arctic about that there are people living in this area, that it's not Antarctica. And there are thriving communities for millennia living there, millions of people. And the same holds true for instance, extraction of oil and gas and mining. And it's interesting, like some Alaskan friends of mine have told me, you cannot possibly be both against oil and gas exploration and mining. Because if you want to do away with all gas guzzling cars, you need electrical cars. And to create batteries and to create electrical cars, you need mining. So the challenge, as I see it for the Arctic, is just general misconceptions. And people do not have an enlightened sort of view on, well, if you are going to do this or do away with this, you need this in return. And so that's interesting with the Dutch discussion, which I was not aware of. Because if you want to do away with CO2 emissions and you want to reduce the flaring and burning of natural gas, you need to do it somewhere else. You need to bring out the energy from somewhere else. And So like there's this famous economic phrase, there's no such thing as a free lunch. You know, you cannot really both have your cake and eat it. You know, if you want to make some changes, of course you will have an impact somewhere else in the economy and in society.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Alexander Richter. Would you like to pose your question?
Well, actually, I just would like to comment.
Okay, please.
So when we looked into geothermal in Canada, for example, in the Arctic, I think one of the reasons that we've seen of an interest created in geothermal has simply been the fact, for example, the military up north, they were flying in oil for power production. So the cost of that was tremendous. And that's when the military in Canada actually looked into geothermal as a potential way of producing electricity. I guess heating was not even looked at that point. And I think in this context, we need to kind of look at what the minister said at the beginning. It started all with a farmer in Iceland putting a pipe into a hot spring and utilizing it for heating, and out of that evolved something much more. And I think a similar story is from Alaska at Chena Hot Springs, where a gentleman had a hot spring and then a resort, and out of that looked at what more to do with it. The greenhouse, a power generation unit. I mean, and it shows kind of like within an innovative approach, we can make such an impact. That same gentleman is now planning a bigger project in Unalaska for power generation, with the potential also then to build greenhouses for a local community. And I think understanding the economic value and the social value that this provides for communities is something that we need to sell. So I guess the notion of understanding where there is, geothermal manifested on the surface in the Arctic creates opportunities, and mapping this out with people that live close to these locations provide opportunities. And I think this is what we need to sell. And that then kind of goes into the discussion of what Martin was talking about. Who would have thought that the Netherlands sits on geothermal potential? And the way it was is that it was looked at as an opportunity to cut down in cost and then targeting carbon emissions. And I think the same applies to the Arctic, and I guess from a cost perspective, even more so. And then understanding that this goes hand in hand with economic and social development and improving living conditions. And at the same time, saving back on having to transport the food and providing more fresher food on site makes such a huge impact. And that's why geothermal is such an attractive element for that part in the Arctic.
Martin.
Of course, I think using the scale will depend on the environment itself, and let's say on the society. So I really think that for smaller companies, you can have smaller greenhouses, which means that you need smaller geothermal doublets. But if you are growing on really large scale, as in the Netherlands, yeah, you can afford yourself to drill 3 kilometers deep and have a 20 megawatt hour capacity. So I really believe in the concept that it should be fixed on local circumstances and the fit between the demand of your local food, as well as the size of your greenhouse and the potential in the subsoil. It needs all to be fixed together, of course, so you can optimize it and maybe think about yourself and plant some new greenhouses after a few while, so make it bigger. I think you can easily scale up, but I believe in different concepts for different circumstances.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm now going to invite, we have another presentation, so I'm going to ask, we'll switch. Oh, did you want to say something more? Oh.
No, thank you, Jennifer.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to ask Dirk Janssen, who's the lead researcher and virologist at the, let me see if I can do this, Instituto de Investigación y Formación Agraria y Pesquera de Andalucía. No, I tried. I want to give you your opportunity to present. If everyone else can turn their cameras off for a minute, we'll let Dirk present.
Thank you very much. Thank you much, Jennifer. I'm trying to. Do you see my presentation or not? No.
Not yet. No.
Okay. Sorry.
While we're waiting, I'll tell you, I realize I didn't tell you that Dirk is going to be presenting on greenhouses, heat and cold climates, the problems. Oh, and then there we go. Now his presentation is up.
Okay, Jennifer, thank you very much for your perfect introduction. And thank you also, Thomas, for the invitation. And good afternoon to all of you. Well, my presentation, my short presentation starts from my context. I work at EFAPA, which is the Research and Training Institute of the Andalusian government. And this is where I'm working right now. I'm sitting there at my desk. You can see me in the midst of my work. That's all these greenhouses, and that's my object. Here I compare the greenhouses in cucumber and tomato in Spain and in Iceland. So you see we have a bit more of hectares and produce a bit more of tons of produce of tomatoes and cucumber compared to Iceland. But the geothermal heating, I understand, makes it possible to have profitable greenhouses now in Iceland. There's another technology which I think is also important, which is electric lighting. LED lights, which now makes it possible to produce the year-round tomatoes, cucumbers in Iceland. And therefore, now it looks more and more that the problems, also the problems of Iceland could be comparable to many Mediterranean countries. So maybe we should change the map and locate Iceland soon here. So this is my place. And the idea I would like to throw in is that these conditions now of thermal heating and continuous lighting make it possible to have the introduction of exotic pests. Now here we see an article from a Belgian press. It says, be careful for Bemisia, which is a whitefly, a pest, because it now can be present in greenhouses in Belgium and in Holland. The problem with these pests is that they transmit a lot of viruses, and that is one of the fears now in northern countries. So this could well also happen in the future in Iceland, because as Sigurdur Markussen said, now greenhouses in Iceland can virtually expand in an unlimited way. Also, David said this is a scalable matter. So if the problems also are scalable, we should be taken care of. So what probably in greenhouses of Iceland also could be doing is monitor for these pests, for these vectors, think of biological control, integrated pest management. And that's so a group of viruses linked to a pest like Bemisia. There's also another group of viruses which are very important on a world scale and maybe also for Iceland, which are seed and contact transmitted viruses. Some examples in cucumber are cucumber green mottle mosaic virus, and in tomato brown rugosa fruit virus, and pepino mosaic virus. In these cases, we need resistant varieties, which we do not have yet. And so we depend on hygiene and prophylaxis, certified virus-free seeds, hygiene, disinfection of materials. And there are also some new techniques like cross protection. So just only a few minutes, I'll try to summarize and highlight one of the themes I think is interesting to link food security with sustainability and food safety. Okay, that's my short talk. Thank you for your attention.
That's excellent. I really like that you've brought in this idea of food safety. In addition to, I mean, food security cannot be food security without food safety. And I'd love to hear from some of our other panelists, I mean, about this idea of pests and viruses and things, and how are they being currently managed in I imagine there's a slightly different dynamic because the outside area is not as warm or can be quite a bit cooler in many contexts. So what might that be like? But I'm curious. Do you is there a stable pest management system in your context that greenhouses and geothermal in the northern context could learn from, or do you feel like it's something that still needs to be developed more?
Of course, northern countries can, or Arctic countries, which have year-round production in greenhouse, for sure can learn from mild climate and warm climate countries, because we have been working very hard on IPM and sustainable pest control and virus and disease control. So I fear that if the greenhouses in Iceland, for instance, will expand, sooner or later it will also have to cope with these problems.
Great, thank you so much.
I'm
going to invite our last speaker, and then we'll go back to a larger discussion again. So Martin Alm, who's the application expert at Alfa Laval, is going to speak to us about technical aspects of geothermal energy and the development of greenhouses and fish farms. Martin.
If I manage to share my screen, is it up now? Do you see some tomatoes?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, great. So thank you for inviting me. I will not share light on how to use and grow crops in greenhouses, but I will enlighten you a little bit about the parts surrounding the greenhouses. So as you see in my title there, I'm actually managing district heating and applications within the HVAC industry, where we also put geothermal energy. So that's my background, so an engineer within that. So just a picture showing what the equipment that we supply to the unit, to the world, would be used. So this is climating of people in tall buildings, and of course climate control is something that is of high interest to people, but also to crops, and that is basically the connection. So geothermal, if we look backwards the last, let's say 30 or so years, we've been exploring a lot of geothermal energy for comfort purposes in many countries. But the greenhouses is fairly new, I would say, and the Dutch market is one of those actually leading as it is today. But also Turkey, for instance, where we supply quite a lot of equipment. But this, and I think I will try to make a short connection with the legislation. Taxes is for sure driving this a lot, and I think we heard in the beginning that it's either courageous decisions from individual people or companies or from politicians. And we see paving the ground in Dutch right now, or in Holland, or the Netherlands, which you prefer, Martin, that the tax reduction on geothermal for greenhouses is paving the way. But we could see expanding the use of geothermal energy to individual houses as well. But there we don't see the same tax reductions. So I think we would be able to use geothermal a lot more if we had more courageous politicians. Yeah, let's see. So basically, changing source of energy, it's not a problem. I think making the switch to geothermal energy from a technical perspective, I don't see. And Thomas, you invited me, asking me to tell a bit about the technical issues or problems that we can see. And of course, there are always technical issues and problems. As an engineer, I really enjoy problems and problem solving, but there are no problems that cannot be solved. So there are no unsolvable problems in this industry, which is nice, of course. So only opportunities, I would say. On the other hand, of course, there's legislation, there's financial things that are more of a problem, I would say. I would just like to say something else as well. On the right-hand side, we have a picture of a city, or typically houses and shops and so on. And of course, there are very big similarities of heating and cooling down crops or people. And in this case, if it's done by geothermal or something else, it doesn't really matter. And I would see if there are maybe some opportunities also in the Arctic climate, because we see quite a lot of data centers, for instance, where we could harvest low-grade heat that could also be used for heating people or crops. So I think we could really investigate other options as well in parallel with the geothermal heat sources. Yeah, and of course, when we have waste incineration and so on, why not use that heat either as district heating straight off or district heating in combination with fish farms, greenhouses, all kind of energy demands that we see out there. So I think that is basically what I was trying to say. So don't limit yourself in what is possible, what opportunities there is to use either geothermal as it is, geothermal for electricity and using the low-grade heat for heating purposes. We have some really nice, interesting projects ongoing where, for instance, we see a company that are using residual from pea crops together with it's industry that are freezing down peas, and from the condensers on the freezing machines and the refrigeration machines, they take the condenser heat to heat up shrimp production, and the shrimps would then be fed with the residuals from the production of the peas. So really circularity in the best of shapes. I think that is roughly what I was aiming at.
Wonderful, thanks. Yeah, this is a real theme I think that we're hearing in terms of thinking about geothermal is this idea of finding innovative interconnections between different things, and I think that your example of sort of using the peas, the frozen peas, and the energy runoff from that, and to do something else, and the same with of combining heating with greenhouses and different things. I think it's it's a theme that I'm hearing here. I actually want to steal Scott Andrews' question, since you touched on the issue of regulation. Scott asked the question in the chat about, is the regulatory environment or the risk to the investor the main problem holding geothermal development back? And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, given your comments that you made during your presentation.
Yes, it's of course one of the limiting factors, if not the biggest, maybe one of the bigger ones. For sure, the geothermal potential is huge in most markets. You know, even in being in Sweden, where we utilize a lot of the shallow geothermal sources together with heat pumps, but we are now also exploring for the deep drilling. We don't have good potential when it comes to high temperatures, but it's available. And there is already grids, and we are having some support from the politicians. Well, we go for it. But in many markets, there is not that kind of support, and of course, things are not happening by itself. You really need to be very ambitious and have a hard head to really cope in those environments. So it's the local. I think Martin mentioned as well. We need to do this with the local possibilities that we do have, and from a technical point of view, it's possible in all markets. There are other things that hinders us.
Yeah, and I mean, not that you should know the answer, but I'll ask, and then maybe I'll invite others to come back on the screen if they, and I'd be interested in other people's answers. Are there certain jurisdictions that have got it more right? I'm not saying anyone's got it right, but are there certain jurisdictions where you do see more an enabling policy environment for geothermal than in others? And would you have an example?
If I take one, it would be the carbon tax. It's not legislation as such, but once we get a level playing field, game field regarding taxes, well then we see a whole different story. For instance, in Sweden, your natural gas is not really an option for the industries because it's taxed. So.
Right. Very good. Martin, did you have the other Martin, did you have a response to that as well, or?
Yeah, I was thinking about, it's a good question, and of course it's fit to a proper business case. And in the Netherlands, we have now green geothermal for about 10, 12 years. And now the national government is in place to change over the mining law specifically for geothermal. So until now, we didn't have a specific mining law for geothermal. And that will be both integrated with the law for environmental issues. So it will be all changed, and legislation will always be behind practice in the end. So, but it will develop, and the same will change over for the subsidy scheme. So it will be more fit for purpose. So that will change up, but it takes a long way of lobbying to discuss what's going on, what you need. And the government in the Netherlands was very, how can I say, aware that they shouldn't over-subsidize geothermal. So it should be, in the end, a subsidization of the greenhouse industry for the Netherlands. So you cannot discuss it over in Brussels. So it's really focused on, it should be fit on purpose. But in the end, the investors are also very critical on how the legislation will go on. And it's not only the geothermal operator who is learning from operations, but it's also the state supervisor of mines. It's also the contractors. Everyone is learning. And if you're learning and something is going wrong, we already get the discussion for the state supervisor of mines or the contractor shouldn't be aware of. So in the end, I think it's really needed that you have more or less like a safety zone in which both the public as well as the private sector can learn both for new technologies, and I can say make some normal return on investments, not too much, but also not too little. And then you more or less have an environment in which you can innovate. And otherwise, the politics will really put you under pressure, and fear in the end won't make anything change. So I think to come to a safe zone in which you more or less can prototype and learn from each other really is the best way for new regions to come up. And I think the safety zone really has to be, how can I say, fundamented in a governmental way. So it's both the politics as well the entrepreneurs as well the society who wants to have the same intention. This is really important. Otherwise, you more or less start differently, and like the presentation from Barney was, it more or less needs also to be in balance to make it a success.
Great. Yeah, I think those are all such great points. I'm just going to invite everyone else to turn their cameras back on, our panelists. I have a question for Dirk. So Dirk, the question is, in your opinion, which vegetable would make the most sense for production in the Arctic? We have to find.
Well, I don't seem to be able to put on my camera.
Let's see. I can maybe turn it on for you. Let's try that. Do you get a notice?
Yes.
There you go. So question for you about vegetables in the Arctic.
Well, I can only think about greenhouses, and well, I think virtually any vegetable that you would think of that would fit in greenhouses would be interesting. Nowadays, I think mostly tomatoes and cucumbers are grown. So if that's what people want, you can expand, you can make more of that. It just depends. Other crops that do very well are, of course, peppers and cucurbits. I don't know, apart from cucumber. I don't know if melons are wanted in Iceland, but I'm sure you can also grow that now that you have this geothermal energy and lighting. So virtually any crop that you can think of, you can grow it.
Great. Well, since we're back to Dirk, I'm curious if anybody, I know not everyone, people are more experts in geothermal than maybe greenhouses, but in terms of the issues of pests and diseases, any sense of how those types of things have been managed in an Arctic context, or if it's at all been an issue in an Arctic context? No. Wrong question to ask.
No, no,
Yes.
okay.
Martin.
Yeah, from origin, I'm a horticultural engineer, so I know something about growing. and Jennifer, you ask about the crop, and I was thinking about cannabis, but I know it's legal in some states or in Canada.
It's in Canada,
but,
yep.
Yeah, right. But the good thing of geothermal, that is year round, and you also need it in summer in the Netherlands to heat up your crop early in the morning. Otherwise, it will be condensed and you get a lot of fungi. And probably it will be the same also on the Arctic. So I think if you have a geothermal plant and it's available, you can easily put some extra heat in it just to prevent fungi to grow. So it's really important that you have the capacity also to steer it, but it makes you also like a safety grower because the source is already there. So that's more or less how can I say, a plus if you compare it to the use of gas.
Right. I'm going to change tracks now. David, I'm curious, we've been talking about this sort of upfront investment and the different motivations. Given that you're at the beginning of a process of putting this in place, who's behind this? Who is it, a public or a private? I mean, public as in, like, what kind of support do you have to put this forward, this project that you're working on?
Well, it's got some private money in it. It's got some Kitsilus money in it. And it's got a bunch of mostly federal grants that we've applied for. The probable total cost would be maybe around $7 million Canadian. And I know we talked a little earlier, our estimate for doing electricity generation instead of direct use is roughly an order of magnitude. So roughly another zero. So we think it would cost in the range of $70 million Canadian plus 10 times the hot water flow to make a commercially viable electrical. So we're delighted that government policy switched on us midstream and we were able to successfully transition from a planned electricity generation to direct use, which we see is probably more profitable per dollar of investment. Did I answer your question though?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it comes back to me though, that, I mean, in everyone's experience is like, I mean, I think of the foreign minister's comment about sort of the decision to begin with geothermal and heating, but is it normally a decision of developing infrastructure without necessarily assuming that you have the business case, if for lack of a better way of saying it, or like how often is it the business case and it's economically viable versus when it meets particular infrastructure needs, and so it's a public need that can be met in a new way? I don't know if I'm
well, we couldn't spend another $4 to $5 million without having a contract to purchase the energy in place. And it's not something it's not speculative. You'd have to have because some of it may end up being a loan that we've got to make payments on the loan. We're still exploring. Canadian government is putting out a lot of money in infrastructure, a lot of money in clean energy. And unfortunately for us, Aboriginal rights are a key issue here. We're on non-treaty land. So most of Canada were treaties settled between the Aboriginal people and the government of Canada. But up in the kind of the BC, they never signed treaties. So there's quite a political juggling going on, and that's working very much in our favor. It wouldn't be of interest to international audience, but it's just the political world for us is very favorable in terms of Aboriginal rights, which leads to, we think, some more money. We're feeling quite optimistic.
And do you mind me asking, is the motivation primarily to meet community needs, or is there some aspiration to be able to produce for communities beyond Kitsalis? Like, is there some idea of exporting any of this, or is it primarily the idea about community needs?
We're an economic development agency, and we're just mercenary economists. We're about generating profit for the community to use for socially desirable things like a community house or pay for some of those community greenhouses. But the bigger project certainly involves energy and energy for export, you know, different types of energy, actually. And certainly once we can get one project in place, and if we can start with direct use, we could easily move towards hydro, because by then we'll know a lot about the characteristics of the heat reservoir. And so it's the first one. It's always the hardest on any project. And so we're in that stage now, but the sky's the limit, really. This thing's massive in our experience right now.
Right. Thank you. Alicia, I'm curious, I mean, you talked about case studies. So in your context of case studies, are the motivations primarily business oriented in terms of developing geothermal, or are they more public good intentions?
It differs. It differs what type of a case study we're talking and we're thinking. However, as I can hear what my speakers were talking just right now, I believe that very important in here is this community engagement. I know that the money mostly comes from the government, and there is a support from financial big money there, all private investments. But I think, as David just said, in Canada as well, not only Canada, Iceland here or other parts, the communities, or probably as well in Spain, communities are the part, which are very important to bring the money as well, or to understand all types of the risks which we have. They have to be clear out, and they have to be understandable by the people who are gonna to use it. By the end of the day, if you wanna to have a greenhouse in your backyard, we are the specialists. However, there's a lot of the people, Spain, Iceland, who would love to have it. They have resources, like they have a hot water or something like this in the backyard, literally, but they might not know how to do this. And therefore, for the community to understand, the municipalities should come in and develop them and showcase this is how we can do. And then that's why our case study is different, either for the crowd thermal or the geothermal or the DRSO. There where we fight and try to showcase that these are the projects, this is how you can do, and trying to engage and build up different types of licenses, different types of policies, so that regular people who are not specialists, scientists, they can just use it in a so-called backyards, so to speak. That's, I think it's quite important for that.
No, it's a great point. I mean, at the end of the day, it should meet communities' needs, or so engaging them early should be an important aspect of defining what the needs are and what can meet those needs. So, any other sort of experiences from others with sort of the motivations behind initiating projects? Yes, please, Harti.
Maybe just to follow up a little bit on what Alicia is saying, that I think the risk is a very important element here, and therefore the government or communities would need to help with that, because it's difficult, especially in a new territory and a new area, to basically for a private person to fund a drilling of a well without knowing whether you get anything out of it and so on. So I think the first steps always need to involve some kind of a guarantee or some kind of assistance from the government, I would say, and this or the municipality or the community itself somehow. I think that's very important, and what we have been doing in Geothermica, for example, is to basically combine funding agencies of Europe to accelerate geothermal in Europe, as I say. So this could also be done within the Arctic regions, if governments and funding agencies of the countries, in the Arctic they could combine them, their forces basically, and fund projects like this. I think that it's a very interesting way of getting, you know, projects on geothermal started in a new region. I think that's something that might be doable as well. And crowd thermal is, of course, something that is a good example of how basically to engage the local community, the persons themselves, to fund a project locally, because geothermal is more or less always increase of quality of living. I think that's really important element, and basically not only to generate electricity or do some industry processes or something like that. It's also just to get heat, to get, you know, spas and things like that, and just to have an access of hot water all the time is very important.
I'm just curious, so I mean, it strikes me that there are now some really strong examples for the viability of geothermal as in certain contexts, to make the point that it's not cost effective in all cases, but the business case or the viability is there. So have you seen over time that, given that, like, for example, if you were to look at Iceland and the strength of geothermal and in Iceland, are other jurisdictions, other countries looking at that and therefore more willing to invest in geothermal? Like, do you have to have a successful case in your own jurisdictions? Are people working across jurisdictions to be able to learn from each other, and how might that help in an Arctic context?
I think this is always increasing quite a lot, and people are starting to understand, you know, what geothermal is. You know, we Icelanders are very lucky that we have very sort of easy access to geothermal. So that was mainly often the comment we got. Yeah, it's so easy for you. You can say, you can tell. It's not a problem for you. But people are starting to understand that even though we are very lucky and it's easy here, it can also be done elsewhere. And with increased energy cost, with increased sort of demand for higher quality of living everywhere, geothermal can play a much bigger role now. And people are starting to understand that. And I think knowledge transfer between regions and communication on that is very important. And yeah, I feel that people are starting to realize the opportunities that geothermal really can do, because very often people have linked, you know, renewable energy to electricity and nothing else, you know, and it's for sure not many places in the world that can produce electricity from geothermal in an economical way, but heat and higher quality of living, higher standards of living is very accessible, very everywhere, and where you have you don't need more than maybe 20 to 30 degrees of hot water to increase the quality of living in your area. And I think that's but again, this is always a question of, you know, what is economical and what price tag do you want to put on you know, of the quality. So that's especially in these smaller regions, and economy of scale is not that easy to reach.
Yes, please, Sigurdur. There you go.
I just want to follow up on what Hjalti was saying. Now with the increased focus on sustainability and especially now in the COVID situation, when resilience is becoming more and more important, I think what one has to ask himself is what price tag are we willing to put on sustainability and resilience? Mm-hmm. Because for example, in Iceland, we see that if I look at it from the, you know, high temperature point of view, we look at it as a very interesting business opportunity for example, for the food industry, that we can offer stable price for 15 years. Companies working in the food industry are maybe more and dependent on gas. They are used to fluctuations in gas price based on geopolitics and so on. But we can you know, we know what price we will have to pay over the next 15, 20 years. And the stability increases the resilience as well. So I think that this, and I think COVID will probably put pressure on this thinking as well, that we will think about geothermal as a factor to increase the resilience of societies.
I think that's such an important point, that this isn't necessarily always an economic, like a business decision, but a quality of life decision and a resilience decision. I asked the question, and this is a technical question, and maybe it's a silly one, but so what you're ultimately the longer term costs, it sounds to me like there's a lot of upfront costs to geothermal, but in terms of the maintenance of geothermal, I take it it's relatively predictable compared to other energy sources. Is that right?
Yeah, if your resource is stable and the chemistry is favorable, then the operational cost is very low, I think, compared to, you're not paying for the fuel. So compared to fossil fuels, for example, and if you're talking in this context about direct use, then the components of it are only pipes and heat exchangers. So it's a very simple equipment. And in some occasions you're using pumps, but so I think that this is something that we should focus definitely more on as a selling point for geothermal. But since I have the word, I wanted to comment on one thing that Dirk talked about, and you as well, Jennifer, is I think now we are seeing kind of disruptive times in the food industry. We are seeing increased need for food production globally, and increased pressure on the ecosystems as well, and we will see all sorts of different behavior towards food, and I think that in geothermal, both we will see increased opportunities because food production is more moving indoors into control systems, but we will also see opportunities for geothermal in other food sectors, not only cucumbers and tomatoes. There's a lot happening in alternative proteins and algae production and all types of bio-based production that requires maybe 35 degrees, and it is of course more high tech maybe interested than primitive greenhouses. But I think geothermal can serve such a big part of the food industry, also with drying or freeze drying or the processing part. So I think we should not only limit ourselves to maybe the most primitive part of food production.
It's a great point. It brings me to a question for you, Heather. You talked about infrastructure as being an important part, and as you come to a point where potentially countries like Iceland could do export of food products, what more is needed that would allow for the transportation of that resource to other places? Is the infrastructure in place, and what would you see the markets being for that?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. We are lucky that we were sort of in the middle of the tensions between the superpowers during the Cold War. So NATO basically built us an excellent international airport, 3 high-tech airline strips to no expense to us. And that's why we were able to sort of build tourism here, because we had basically an international airport of great quality. So, but to your question, because we have this airport, which serves also as a cargo hub, we have good connections. The idea here has been to grow sort of expensive types of, let's say, cherry tomatoes that would go to the restaurant business, and it would not go to a commodity exchange of vegetables, but to some high-end restaurant catering business. And the obstacles for that were not that we didn't have enough fresh water. We had plenty of fresh water. We had plenty of geothermal. one of the largest constraints for being in this business and exporting vegetables from Iceland was the lack of affordable labor, basically. So we couldn't compete with Spain on labor costs. We couldn't compete with anywhere where you have a thriving tomato sort of agriculture. So there have been all kinds of ideas on how, but now of course we've seen with new inventions like Plenty in the US, where they're building more lateral rather than horizontal agriculture, or let's say indoor agriculture, greenhouses. It's becoming more and more mechanical. You rely less and less on tomato pickers. And that means that in the future, this might be, it might be economical here. But we can also look at one of the main ingredients for any food production, which is water. And in the Arctic, of course, you have plenty of water. So fresh water and a tomato, I don't remember, what is it, 99% water. So if you use clean, fresh Arctic water, it makes sense. And it also, just like what people have been trying to do with still water, bottled water, to create a special type of, you know, it is a distinction. You know, if you have even though it may sound funny to sell tomatoes from the Arctic, but if you have more pollution elsewhere and less drinkable and less fresh water elsewhere, it might be a selling point.
It's interesting you say that. The SCWG hosted a session that was involved in food security last week as well. And one of the things that came up in that was the attractiveness of products from the Arctic, and that there's actually a market for products from the Arctic. So, but what strikes me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things that Iceland has also done very well is do the more move up the value chain in terms of the products that it does send out, and that it's doing that more and more. So not just sort of raw materials, but actually trying to produce higher end goods
Yes.
for export.
And what's been helping us there is that we have this abundance of fish around the island and very stable fish stocks, which have been well managed. And for comparison, in 1980, we caught 3 times as much cod as we catch today. But if I use the same sort of ISK rate and if I correct for inflation and all of that, even though we catch just 1/3 of the catch of cod we did 40 years ago, the prices we fetch are something like triple. Mm-hmm. The reason is that in 1980, we only harvested 40% of any given fish that we picked out of the sea. Now it's 97%. So all kinds of extra stuff has gone into creating some medicine, some food supplements, mm-hmm. even some fashion items out of the skin and God knows what. So we, in this regard, you know, talking about the circular economy and responsible harvesting, we're now using 97% of any fish that we catch, any caught. And that, of course, is something that we have then been able, with that sort of, let's say, knowledge, trying to replicate in other industries, how to fully utilize the resources that we're using. And that has led, for instance, to the circle of, you know, create a power plant, which creates a tourist spot, which creates a fish farm, which creates a lot of greenhouses.
That's great. Thank you. I have a totally different question to ask. I'm going to change the topic completely, but before I do that, did anyone else want to get in on this conversation? Yes, please, Martin.
I was wondering, we are, let's say, dealing worldwide with the supply chain, and it's both on infrastructure, on supplying food globally, but we also, in the middle of a crisis, we are moving our goods worldwide. and we just discussed that it's very interesting to grow your own food in the end, either it's your own region or etc. You can also figure it out by a total CO2 footprint. So from the way how many energy it takes to grow your tomato and to transport it from, how can I say, Tunisia to New York. And in the end, if you have those life cycle analysis of the food, it's not only about money, but it's also about the total CO2 footprint you have in your food, you have on your plate. Mm-hmm. And I'm really thinking about the idea because you have different locations around the Arctic which can go for it, for the match of greenhouse industry and geothermal. I'm asking myself the question, how will we go forward after this conversation today? And I'm really thinking about working out some cases in which you do not only, let's say, think about the concepts, but in the end also think about the euros per kilograms or the amount of scale or the, in the end, the total investment, can I say, picture. So we make it more based on facts and figures, and I think in the end we all need our facts and figures to do our lobby right.
And so, are you ultimately suggesting that that analysis would demonstrate the strength of geothermal as a means of, because of its energy sustainability? Yeah. So I mean, it's about being able to tell the story properly in comparison to other things. Yes.
But in the end, it will always goes about money. It's always about politics, etc. So we need to have our figures and our facts on right. And I think it's for the total Arctic, it's more or less comparable.
Yes, that's a perfect segue to my next question, which was for Bjarni, bringing us right back to the beginning and to his idea of sustainability. And I'm just wondering, your new sort of presentation spoke of environment, social, and governance. So where does economics fit in that? In the sense that, I mean, in the traditional sustainable development model, we always have social, economic, and environment. You talked about sustainability specifically. So where does economics fit in that model?
Good question. Economics are obviously a key of any sustainable development, and perhaps, you know, the fourth component could have been economical and financial aspects, and we're obviously, like, I think it was Martin that mentioned in his presentation earlier, the people, planet, profit concept. So this is definitely all integrated and all serving kind of the economical and financial elements to this. So you can't be sustainable, definitely talking from a company's point of view, unless you're financially sustainable as well, both from a company perspective and also from a project's perspective. And maybe on that topic, and also related to Heiðar's comment on the circular economy, for example, and of course all of the geothermal and different types of projects that we're discussing here. I also happen to be a managing partner at the Nordic Circular Hotspot, kind of an umbrella organization of the circular economy in the Nordics. And we have been discussing financing of circular economy activities, including many of the projects that we've been discussing here. I believe there are huge opportunities, both in terms of grants and also financing from private markets, both with equity and fixed income in the types of projects we're discussing here. So that is also that I would like to point out and that we keep in mind.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, it is a great point. This idea of the circular economy does fit quite naturally with the concept of sustainability, and yet we've just come to and it is a very strong element of Iceland's geothermal and the initiatives they've taken that you've taken internationally as well. So I wonder, I mean, it strikes me that, I mean, this is an extremely theoretical question, but in some cases, I guess, if you look over the life cycle of a project, you could accept that especially if you're driven by community needs, which is another thing we spoke about, that you could have a project that's not economically viable at the front end, but with the anticipation that as it's able to diversify and bring in other elements, that perhaps the expectation would be that it could become economically viable. Is it reasonable to advance technology without the economic factor, without thinking about it being a money maker, or does it need to have that economic factor to be viable?
Well, I guess, I mean, I'm sure others in the panel have opinions on this, but maybe perhaps on this life cycle view, I mean, operating a real estate or a building in Iceland, you know, in the operational phase, it emits close to none CO2 during the operational phase. But if you include the life cycle, it emits a lot during the construction and the acquiring of raw materials and stuff. So, I mean, I think we also always have to, also in terms of sustainability project or any of the projects we're looking at here, looking at the entire life cycle. I mean, sure, I mean, different, just like companies have certain departments that don't make profit, they lose money, but the overall aim of the entire project or the entire company is to, I guess, generate enough money to be sustainable. So I think we also have to keep that in mind in terms of talking about specific projects like that.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm coming to the end. Does anybody have any last things they want to say before we wrap up? Yes, please, Martin.
I think very shortly, let's say in conjunction with what you said, Björn, here, that I'm not saying it's a right route for this, but if we look at district heating, which I'm highly involved in many markets, we see basically the same. And I guess it's the same in Iceland as well, that a lot of the investments, you know that the payback will come on long term. So there have probably been some kind of involvement from the municipality, from the regional council or so what, to take some of the initial cost or even be part owner of the investments over long term. And if you know that it will give a payback in 20 years, a company would not take that decision probably, but for the greater good, of course, with a benefit, with a good financial payback over long term, it could be investment done also on the public level.
Yeah, it's a great point. From a public perspective versus a private perspective, you may make the decision differently. So, all right. Well, I think we've come to a nice ending. I have been asked that the panelists stay on when we've wrapped up, but I want to thank all of you and to all our participants for spending this time together. I've found it hugely fascinating, and I've really enjoyed it, and I've learned a lot. And thank you. So I hope that, and I believe there are other sessions planned. So I hope to have the opportunity to see you all again soon. So. I think that brings us to the end. Thomas, are you going to reappear?
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you very much, Jennifer. And I would like to say thank you to all the speakers here present. It has been a very good session. I've been impressed and amazed about the whole wide range of topics that have been tackled. And as well, all the solutions that have been proposed, all the further thoughts for future development. So that have been very good. Thank you very much again to all of you. And I really would like to encourage you to continue exchanging between all of you. And maybe we will see future projects in the Arctic to be developed. And I would like to say thank you again to Embla, the director of the Icelandic Arctic Cooperation Network, to Otto Eliasson, which is a project manager for AIMER, with Elva as well, project manager for SSNE, for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Icelandic chairmanship of the Arctic Council for co-organizing this first webinar of a long run, And I would like to say thank you very much, and see you soon for another session.